Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism, looking at a particular horror trope in depth and exploring how it's been presented throughout horror film history. Currently, we're looking into vampires. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. Alongside our regular series, occasionally on the podcast we'll cover new releases that we really want to talk about, and sometimes I also get the chance to talk to the filmmakers behind those. In today's bonus episode, I got to chat to the writer-director of Possessor, Brandon Cronenberg. For anyone who hasn't seen Possessor yet, first of all, what are you waiting for? It is out on VOD in the UK now. In this interview, we do not spoil any details from the film. We discuss it genuinely and touch up on the making of it, but we don't reveal any plot details for those of you who are spoiler averse. Once you've seen the film though, and if you want to dig deeper into the meaning behind it, we have also published a very long, in-depth discussion episode going into the details of Possessor. And with that said, please enjoy my conversation with Brandon Cronenberg. First of all, congratulations. Absolutely loved and was disturbed in the best possible way by Possessor.
Oh, thank you so much.
So I always like to start interviews by asking kind of what came first in your process in developing the film. Was it an image? Was it a character, a particular scene?
In the case of Possessor, it came from a very sort of trivial personal place. I was on the press tour for Antiviral, my first feature. And when you're traveling with a film for the first time, it's very surreal because you're in real time, either consciously or unconsciously, constructing this public persona. You go around doing press and you're performing this version of yourself and creating a kind of alternate media self, this weird double that then goes off and has its own life without you online. So for that reason, and because of a few other things going on in my life, I was feeling like I kind of couldn't see my own character in the life I was living. I felt like I was sitting up in the morning and sitting up into someone else's life and having to kind of scramble to construct some sort of character who could operate in that context. So initially, I was interested in writing a film that was about a character who may or may not be an imposter in their own life, and use that as a way to discuss how we build characters and create narratives as a way to operate as people. The other sci-fi horror elements kind of developed out of that later, but actually the seed of the film is in those more dramatic scenes of waking up. The relationship and family scenes are where it started.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about, I'll come back to the themes of identity and empathy, which spoke really strongly to me about the film, but I want to talk a little bit first about the world building and kind of the design of it without giving too much away or giving too much or spending too much time kind of on information really, but really giving us a sense of the world through the environment, the machinery, the advertising, the data mining, the corporation aspect. So kind of how, could you talk a little bit about how you envisioned and worked on designing this alternate world?
I really wanted to make a film set in an alternate present, or it's set, not that this is relevant, but it's set in an alternate version of 2008. That was just sort of how I set it up so that I could compartmentalize. Part of that was because although I did a fair bit of research into the neuroscience behind the technology, and although I think that technology could more or less exist, for it to really exist, it would have to be in the very distant future. And I wasn't interested in making a kind of predictive science fiction film. I wanted to use that as a metaphor to talk about who we are and how we function. And therefore, I wanted the world to feel more familiar and more like our present day world. So setting it in this alternate timeline on the one hand freed me up to use it that way, and on the other hand kind of demanded that we find some interesting ways to kind of skew the world just through the design and through our locations, which are all Toronto locations. It was all shot in Toronto, but we spent a lot of time exploring the city and finding those particular buildings and particular angles that would feel a bit alternate universe and have that quality.
You mentioned it just now, but I was actually wanting to ask you about the choice of setting it in 2008. Was it even an alternative universe of 2008? Why that particular year?
It was slightly in the past.
Slightly.
It was slightly in the past. It just, I guess having it deliberately in the past meant that it was obviously a different timeline, but it was near enough that it would seem close to 2000. It didn't have any really intelligent significance beyond that.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to all the video essays unpacking that decision to come when the film is released.
You can't release this podcast until then. It's important that nobody knows that I'm just making stupid random stuff.
And I wanted to go into the characters a little bit, and particularly the way that you work with your actors, with Andrea and with Christopher. As both of their characters really strike me as quite internal, very kind of internal focused, not giving that much away even to the people who are supposedly closest to them. So could you talk a little bit about your process working with them through the period leading up to the actual making of the film, to the shoot?
I mean, the process was very organic and very easy because they're both fantastic actors and obviously, but also really wonderful collaborators. And so they really made me look good and really made my life easy. Initially, there was some discussion to be had about how we would deal with the fact that they were both playing the same character to a certain degree, or that overlap. And I remember talking to them early on about whether there was some sort of rigid formal process they wanted to engage in. Did one of them want to sort of take the lead and the other one mimic them, or did they want to be on set for each other's scenes, or how did they want to work that? There was kind of a rabbit hole we could go down in terms of figuring out process. How it actually worked was I had my initial ideas for how those versions of the character could overlap. They came to me with their own ideas, which were great. They're incredibly smart about their characters. I understand that they spoke behind the scenes with each other as well, just directly checking in about how Voss would behave in certain situations to make sure that they were on the same page. And then in a scene-by-scene way, I would work with them individually, and we would just sort of talk it through and build it out. So it all really was built collaboratively and organically in the end, despite the fact that I was expecting it to require some sort of fancy rule set or something.
I mean, it's always really nice to hear that the really mythical process of making a film is actually not that fancy sounding sometimes when it just works out.
No, I mean, it very rarely just works out. It's a perilous pastime, but so much of it, I think, is done in the moment, or at least for me. I know that's not true of all directors. Some directors.
On that note of directing them both essentially playing a melded version of each other, on a practical level, kind of how did you achieve that visual meld of them kind of blending into one another, but it being very clearly two different performers of two different genders?
So some of it was done through performance. For instance, you can see, in certain scenes, Chris will be playing Colin, and then he shifts into Voss, and so he takes on this sort of feminine version of the character. Andrea, when she's in the machine, is speaking in something that's more of an American accent and more with more of a masculine voice when she's performing Colin. Sometimes we would, of course, swap the actors. We would shoot scenes with both of them, and there was a bit of a sculpting process in the edit. Because some scenes, you need it to be more ambiguous in some scenes because there's a kind of struggle. but then in other scenes, you need it to be very clear that one of them is in control. And so some of that was found in the edit as we were tweaking the story and working on that structure. And then there's the sort of hallucinatory elements.
Yeah, that which I will definitely, I can't let you go before asking about that. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of ask about the design of Tassia's character, which I found really just visually striking for someone whose job in the film it is to possess the minds and mimic herself into someone else, into, a myriad of different people. How did you approach designing what she in herself, in her own body, looks like?
I mean, that it was really a collaboration with Andrea. I know she initially really wanted to change her hair color in some kind of striking way, because she's an actor who really likes to completely change visually for each role, and she's amazing at inhabiting these other characters and is such a chameleon, as everyone says about her. But she really is. She's really so different in film, from film to film. So we had a discussion about that and decided on this sort of like not quite albino, but like a little bit ultra blonde, pale quality, which also then contrasts Chris more, who has these much more dark features. She was interested during the initial wardrobe trials she came up with this idea where, because she puts on clothes that match the characters she's about to possess, because she likes to inhabit them in her own life when she's watching them and sort of mimicking them and learning about their lives. She liked the idea that she would have these old clothes that were from previous possessions. So she had men's clothing from some other man that she had possessed in the past. And so I thought that was a brilliant idea, and we incorporated it.
I wanted to move on into the hallucinatory kind of mind melding technology in Possessor, and I wanted to ask kind of what was your collaborative process like working with Dan Martin on designing those sequences and the actual look of what it would look like for two minds to blend together.
Right. So the hallucination sequences were a kind of long process of experimentation in some ways, and then in other ways there were particular images that I was interested in. For instance, the melting wax, I really wanted to do bodies melting and reforming, and so that was something very specific. But otherwise, they were really long experimental processes with Dan Martin on the effects end, and then Kareem Hussein, my cinematographer, who I worked very closely with. We actually lived down the street from each other for a lot of Possessor development, and so I would go over to his place for years, because the film sort of kept on taking a while to get off the ground and kept getting pushed just for the usual indie film development reasons. And we would just experiment with projection feedback and gels and all of these ways that we could deform images, and we'd have these happy accidents that would lead us off down another path, and eventually we had our kind of bank of ideas that we built up over the years. And when Dan came on, so Dan and Kareem are both kind of mad geniuses in their fields, and so Dan had his own ideas that he'd been wanting to try that he would bring to it, and he had all of this great stuff. It's a brief shot, but there's a vacuform mold of Chris's face with Andrea being projected into it, because it's been treated to be a rear projection screen, and then the skin mask that's being pulled off. That was something Dan had always wanted to try, and it seemed to fit really well with the film. So it was just a great collaborative process with those two building these things up. And then after the fact, Matt Hannum, my editor, was very involved with me in the cutting and the rhythms and what that visual language would be like once we amassed this sort of trippy material.
No, they're incredibly effective. I think after I watched Possessor for the first time, my just WhatsApp groups were exploding with people and myself just asking each other, how did they do that? What was that? What is that image? Is that wax? How did that thing happen? So there's a lot of images that frankly I'd never seen before in a film. And I wanted to kind of pick you up on something you mentioned of this kind of image of bodies melting and reforming. And what about kind of this idea of a body transforming or maybe not even belonging to the person inhabiting it was interesting to you?
I think, like so much with science fiction, part of what you're doing when you're writing it is finding a way to talk about the real world through another lens. So you're taking something that we're all dealing with, whether it's political or a more kind of basic human thing, and you're finding a way to turn it on its head so that we're examining it with fresh eyes, and we can kind of look at it from another perspective. So with body possession, I think you start to discuss what it is to have a body and what it is to be in your body, how you relate to your own physicality. That's something that we all are dealing with in a day-to-day way. But when narratively the story is that someone jumps into someone else's body, then suddenly they're having this fresh experience. They're having to deal with the nuance of that physical form. And that's, that's something that's very interesting to me.
And I wanted to kind of pick up on this with the relationship between Tassia and everyone around her, but especially kind of Colin. What do you think she's trying to, what do you think it's saying about our relationship with technology, the way that we're communicating with people through screens and through a distance, or even, in the narrative of Possessor, of being forced into someone else's psyche and body through tech?
There are a few different things. I mean, part of the relationship with technology in the film is kind of a surveillance analogy. I mean, for the Zuthru stuff, it's obviously kind of a joke, and it's more on the nose satire. But I was writing this partly through when the Snowden leaks were happening, and I was feeling very depressed about the death of privacy through technology. And so to some extent, that body possession stands in as a metaphor for surveillance, because instead of someone turning on your webcam or turning on your microphone, they're actually in your body, experiencing the most intimate details of your life firsthand through your own nerve endings, or just as terrifyingly, are in someone else's body who's close to you and are acting as a kind of full body organic sensory surveillance device. That's part of it. I think something that's become maybe more relevant from a tech perspective since I wrote the film is how people are being influenced by social media. I think we're only just starting to understand the repercussions of being in a kind of fully online society, and with, say, Russian interference in the US elections and the various ways that people are being manipulated through data collection, AI, sometimes for very mundane reasons, just to sell them the right things, or for these commercial reasons. I think we're finding that we are all fairly hackable. We're all very vulnerable to extremely subtle influence, but deliberate influence. And I think a major challenge going forward will be, what is human society after that? I think we're in a kind of transitional era where we're starting to understand what we will be in the coming decades and what the challenges there are, but we don't really see it yet. It's only just the tip of the iceberg.
To start wrapping up, I kind of wanted to ask you, what would you like people to take away from the film?
I prefer not to, to answer that question if it's okay. Well, the film is really designed to leave space for an audience to be creative. I had my own specific ideas as I was writing it about what the narrative was and how the characters were evolving throughout it, and the reasoning behind their actions and all. But in terms of the execution, I really wanted to allow for discussion and disagreement. I would like nothing more than for people to completely disagree about what they should take away from the film. So I don't want to preclude the possibility of those discussions happening by telling people what they should think.
That's a great answer. But I do have a slightly silly question that I would love to end on, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
Can you please tell me why everyone vapes so much in the film?
It was partly, I was coming up with ways to make this an alternate universe, and I thought it would be funny if everybody vaped. It was sort of a dumb joke. Although I think vaping is really cinematic. I think it's absolutely ludicrous how much vapor comes out of somebody's mouth when they're vaping. I think that's a pretty striking image. So it may have started there and then become kind of silly. They also have stickers all over their vapes, and I was thinking of Japanese pain bags, or anime fans have those bags, and it was where they're covered in buttons and all of these things. So I thought, okay, maybe in this alternate universe, everybody has animal stickers or something on their vapes. That totally didn't come through, but it was just sort of alternate universe games.
Oh, I love it. That's so that makes it even funnier. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with the film. I'm sure you will need it because it's quite amazing, and it's quite something. I can't wait for everyone to see it and have those conversations and those arguments.
That's incredibly kind of you. Thank you so much for having me.
You have a very special nature, one we've worked hard together to unlock. Pull me out. The results are normal. Anything you want to flag?
No, I'm fine.
Mom! Hi, darling.
How was your trip?
Dull. Extraordinarily dull.
Our next contract's a big one. The target is the CEO of the largest operation in the U.S. You'll be binding to Colin Tate. We can't afford any mistakes on this one.
Ready?
What's with you today?
What do you mean? I'm in place.
Can we help you?
Finish this.
What are you doing? I can't pull the trigger.
I need to know. I need to know what she's done to me.
It's become a danger.
Where is she? Come out or I'll do it!
Sometimes that small thought is all it takes to lose control.